There are moments in human history when a thinker steps out of the crowd, not by shouting louder than others, but by seeing what no one else dared to see. Hannah Arendt was such a thinker. She didn't come with promises or ideologies, nor did she offer a comforting philosophy. Instead, she asked terrifying questions about how ordinary people become participants in extraordinary evil, how the machinery of destruction operates not through monsters, but through men who simply refuse to think. She showed the world that evil doesn't always wear horns or a grimace. Sometimes, it wears a uniform, sits behind a desk, and follows orders without thought. Arendt's idea of the banality of evil remains one of the most haunting insights of the 20th century because it reveals something profoundly uncomfortable about the human condition, that thoughtlessness, not hatred, may be the true root of evil. Born in 1906 in Hanover, Germany, Hannah Arendt grew up during one of the most turbulent times in European history. The world around her was being torn apart by war, ideology, and political chaos. As a young Jewish woman and a student of philosophy, she was drawn to the great questions that had haunted thinkers from Plato to Kant. What does it mean to be human? What is freedom? What makes us act, and what makes us obey? Under the mentorship of Martin Heidegger, a philosopher whose brilliance was as immense as his moral blindness, Arendt was introduced to the depth of existential and phenomenological thought. But when Heidegger pledged allegiance to Hitler's regime, Arendt's life was violently shaken. She fled Germany, leaving behind the world she knew, carrying with her not only the pain of exile but a growing awareness that philosophy, when detached from ethics, can become dangerous. Arendt's life became a witness to the century's greatest horrors. She was arrested by the Gestapo, escaped to France, imprisoned again in a camp for enemy aliens, and finally fled to the United States in 1941. In exile, she turned her pain into thought. She refused to let suffering make her silent. Instead, she used it as a lens to understand the dark machinery of totalitarianism. She wanted to grasp not only how totalitarian systems destroy freedom but how they manage to recruit ordinary people into their service. Her groundbreaking work The Origins of Totalitarianism analyzed both Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, showing that totalitarianism was not a historical accident, it was a modern invention, born from loneliness, bureaucracy, and the decay of genuine thought. But it was years later, in 1961, that Arendt's most controversial and enduring idea emerged. When Nazi officer Adolf Eichmann was captured in Argentina and brought to trial in Jerusalem for his role in organizing the Holocaust, Arendt attended as a reporter for The New Yorker. What she witnessed there didn't fit any of the categories the world had prepared. Eichmann was not a monstrous figure, not a sadistic villain dripping with hatred. He was, in her words, terrifyingly normal. He spoke in clichés. He used bureaucratic language to explain mass murder. He claimed he was just following orders, just doing his job, just obeying the law. In his grey suit and dull demeanor, Arendt saw something deeply disturbing, a man who had stopped thinking. When she wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, she was not excusing him, she was exposing him. Arendt's point was not that evil acts are trivial, but that the people who commit them often are. They are ordinary individuals who abandon the power of judgment, who replace personal conscience with obedience, and who hide behind rules, slogans, and duties. The banality of evil means that immense destruction can arise not from demonic hatred, but from intellectual emptiness, from people who have lost the capacity to think for themselves and to imagine the suffering of others. Arendt believed that thinking is not the same as knowledge. You can be highly educated, and yet completely thoughtless. Eichmann knew how to follow orders, how to fill out forms, how to organize train schedules to Auschwitz, but he did not know how to think. He lacked the inner dialogue that asks, should I, rather than merely, can I? Arendt's message cut deep into the heart of modern civilization. Our greatest danger lies not in the fanatic, but in the obedient. Evil thrives where reflection dies. This was a shocking idea because it held a mirror up to everyone. It forced society to recognize that evil is not some alien force lurking on the edges of humanity, it is a potential within us, especially when we stop questioning. Arendt wrote that thought is what prevents human beings from becoming cogs in a machine. It creates a space within ourselves where conscience can speak. Without that inner space, humans can commit atrocities without realizing the horror of their actions. The problem of the 20th century, she believed, was not merely political, it was existential. The loss of thinking had led to the loss of humanity. Arendt's idea was met with fierce criticism. Many accused her of being cold, of showing sympathy to a Nazi criminal, of misunderstanding the nature of evil. But Arendt's insight was far from sympathetic, it was radical truth-telling. She was exposing how systems of power depend on ordinary compliance, on our willingness to delegate responsibility, on our comfort with not thinking. Totalitarianism, in her eyes, succeeded because it turned people into functionaries. It taught them to obey rather than to judge, to act without conscience, to replace personal responsibility with collective obedience. And when that happens on a massive scale, when entire populations stop thinking, the result is moral catastrophe. She saw this danger not only in Nazi Germany but everywhere bureaucracy expands, where rules replace moral judgment, and where people say, I was just doing my job. That phrase, for Arendt, was the slogan of moral collapse. It was the quiet song of the thoughtless. Thinking, in contrast, is disruptive. It resists conformity. It creates friction. It asks uncomfortable questions. That is why totalitarian systems fear thinkers, they make people unpredictable. Arendt believed that genuine thinking doesn't produce ideology, it produces conscience. It is the power to say no, even when the world demands yes. At the heart of Arendt's philosophy was her deep belief in the human capacity for beginning, for renewal. She called it natality, the power of new beginnings inherent in every human being. Despite the horror she had witnessed, she did not fall into despair. She believed that because humans can think, they can start anew. Every act of thought, every moment of reflection, is a seed of resistance against conformity. Totalitarianism depends on predictability, thinking creates unpredictability. It is the source of freedom itself. In her writings, Arendt distinguished between thinking and knowing. Knowing deals with facts, thinking deals with meaning. You can know everything about a situation, yet fail to understand its moral weight. That's what she saw in Eichmann, someone who knew perfectly well what he was doing, but didn't stop to think about what it meant. Thinking, for Arendt, is the silent dialogue between me and myself. It's what Socrates called the two-in-one. When you think, you converse with your conscience, and that conversation keeps you human. Those who refuse to think silence that inner voice, and in that silence, anything becomes possible. Arendt's lesson is frighteningly relevant today. We live in an age of information overload but reflection poverty. We scroll, consume, and react, but seldom pause to think. The danger of the banality of evil is not confined to totalitarian regimes, it lives in every form of thoughtless conformity, every blind obedience to trends, algorithms, or authorities. When people surrender their judgment to systems, whether political, technological, or social, they become instruments rather than individuals. Evil, Arendt reminds us, doesn't need monsters. It only needs people who stop thinking. Arendt's courage was not only intellectual but moral. She dared to criticize the behavior of her own people during the war, to question the role of Jewish leaders who cooperated with Nazi bureaucracies. This made her a target of hatred from all sides. But Arendt believed that philosophy must speak truth, not comfort. She once said, "The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil." That sentence carries the full weight of her thought. Morality is not automatic. It demands constant awareness, reflection, and choice. Even her relationship with Heidegger offers a profound symbolic contrast between thought and blindness. He, the great thinker of being, failed to think morally when he embraced Nazism. She, his student, became the philosopher of responsibility, insisting that thought must never be separated from conscience. In this sense, Arendt's entire life was a moral response to her teacher's failure, a philosophical act of redemption. As the world rebuilt after the war, Arendt continued to write about freedom, authority, and the public realm. In The Human Condition, she explored what it means to act meaningfully in the world, to be a political being, not in the sense of power, but participation. She saw action and speech as the ways humans appear to one another, creating a shared world. To live without thinking, for her, was to disappear, to become invisible in the moral sense. Thinking, by contrast, keeps the world alive. It creates space for plurality, for diversity, for dialogue. Arendt did not believe in utopias. She was skeptical of any ideology that claimed to have final answers. She called such systems the ends of thinking. Once you think you have the truth, you stop asking questions, and that's where evil begins. Her philosophy is a call for perpetual reflection, for the courage to remain uncertain. Thinking, for her, is not about achieving certainty, it's about staying awake. To understand Arendt is to confront a paradox. She believed deeply in humanity, yet she never flattered it. She saw our greatness and our weakness intertwined. Her insight that evil can be banal was both terrifying and liberating, terrifying because it means no one is immune, liberating because it means anyone can resist, simply by thinking. Thought becomes an act of rebellion. In a world of slogans, propaganda, and manipulation, the simple act of stopping to think is a moral victory. In her final years, Arendt warned that the modern age was producing new forms of thoughtlessness. Technology, bureaucracy, and ideology were creating people who act efficiently but think superficially. She urged us to protect the inner dialogue, to cultivate judgment, to resist the temptation of ready-made opinions. There are no dangerous thoughts, she wrote, thinking itself is dangerous. But that danger is necessary, it's what keeps us free. Arendt died in 1975, but her words echo with startling clarity in the 21st century. Every time a person says, "I'm just doing my job," without asking what that job does to others, Arendt's ghost whispers from history. Every time someone chooses silence over truth, obedience over conscience, or comfort over courage, the banality of evil grows stronger. And every time someone chooses to think, to question, to judge, to stand alone if necessary, the power of thought fights back. Hannah Arendt left behind more than books, she left a challenge. To think, even when thinking hurts. To resist, even when resistance isolates. To never trade conscience for convenience. Her life reminds us that philosophy is not a retreat from the world, it's the world's last defense against meaninglessness. She didn't laugh at humanity like Diogenes or mourn it like Schopenhauer, she held it accountable. The banality of evil, she taught us, is not inevitable. It's a warning. It's what happens when we stop thinking, when we allow ourselves to drift with the current of history. But thought, the quiet act of reflection, of judgment, of self-examination, is our way back. It is the small flame that keeps civilization from falling into darkness. Arendt's philosophy is that flame. It is not dramatic. It does not promise salvation. But it insists that so long as we can think, we can resist. So long as we can question, we can remain human. Hannah Arendt's legacy is this: the power of thought is not in what it solves, but in what it prevents. It prevents the loss of self in the machinery of conformity. It prevents obedience from becoming complicity. And most importantly, it prevents us from forgetting that every great evil began with a small act of thoughtlessness. She taught the world that thinking is not a luxury, it's a responsibility. It's the last wall between civilization and chaos. To remember Hannah Arendt is to remember that freedom begins in the mind. It begins with the courage to ask why, even when everyone else says yes. The world may always contain evil, but as long as there are thinkers willing to confront it, not with violence, but with thought, humanity will endure. Her message, distilled to its essence, is simple yet eternal: never stop thinking. Because the moment we do, evil becomes ordinary. And that, she warned us, is the most terrifying truth of all.